Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to take a look at a study from More in Common into the public's attitude to the recent far-right riots and terror attacks, because if we're going to look at how the government and other politicians are responding and how they might try to tackle the problems in the long term, it's important to know the public perception of them right now, because that usually influences the political action. And the first charts show results very much in line with the polling from YouGov last week. There's a slightly different focus, but it's very much in line. Only a minority of people think those that engaged in the violence had legitimate concerns. Now, that's not the same as excusing the behaviour. There will be people who think the concerns are legitimate, indeed there are, but that the violence was not. But what was interesting is that more people thought the violence was just an excuse to be violent or to loot, rather than actually being driven by far-right ideology and racism. I'm going to say the public may well be close to the truth on this one. We've already seen a number of people sentenced who showed no signs of being racist, no sign of racist motivations. They basically got drunk and thought a bit of public disorder would be a laugh. You know, some of the, particularly for those who maybe in other countries may not, like some of those who got involved maybe saw it as no different to the public disorder that happens after a drunken night out of a weekend. Which is also not acceptable behaviour either, but it happens. And in their minds, they generally get away with it. If someone goes out, gets drunk of a Friday night, and then goes and causes trouble out on the streets, the police usually get there. They might find them. They might stick them in a cell overnight if they're really bad, but ultimately not a lot happens to them. They get away with it. And these people probably didn't realise that from their point of view, it's just the same behaviour, only because they're in the middle of a riot while they're doing it, that increases the level of seriousness and it gets you thrown into prison for more than a night. So the public perception there may well be on the nail that a good chunk of them, if not maybe even the majority, were just there to cause trouble. It was thought it was a good excuse to cause trouble. They didn't think they'd suffer any serious consequences. Which might be why these violence melted away literally as soon as those sentences started being announced to the public. The other thing emerging is that Reform UK voters are much more likely to think that the rioters had legitimate concerns about immigration, but a very large minority of them still saw it as just this excuse to loot or engage in violence. There wasn't very many of them thought this is far-right ideology. And when you go to the next question about whether the rioters represent the real Britain or whether those who cleaned up the mess did, again, the vast majority said, no, the rioters do not represent the real Britain. Again, a noticeable outlier of Reform UK voters. That's a bit of a pattern with this. But the vast majority of even these said the real Britain were those who helped clean up the streets, not those who made that mess in the first place, which shows that regardless of what people think about immigration in this country, and we know, even the clear majority of Reform UK voters who mostly do have those concerns about immigration, they don't think that the violence and destruction is the way to highlight those concerns. And honing in on Reform UK voters again, because like I say, they are just the outlier to every question in the survey, really. Reform UK voters are the only group where more are ashamed of Britain being multi-ethnic than proud. But only by a little, even in that case. It's less than a quarter. And the majority just don't care one way or the other. And, there should be a lesson for the Conservatives here as well, because based on this question, and obviously if you're the Conservative Party looking at this, you'd want to commission your own more detailed questions. But based on this question, you would say there's only 10% of voters overall, of their voters overall, that are clearly racist. And 23% of Reform UK voters, because this isn't asking about immigration, this is specifically asking about ethnicity. So 10% of their voters are ashamed that Britain is multi-ethnic, 23% are Reform UK voters, but the rest aren't. They're either proud or they don't care one way or the other. So in what way does it make sense for the Conservatives to continue racist dog whistling? There's no evidence that it's going to attract any significant number of votes. Immigration issues, separated out, are another matter. There's a huge disconnect between immigration fact and public perception. So you can understand political paralysis there. But racism, not enough committed racists for racist rhetoric to be a vote winner. In terms of the so-called two-tier policing, which the far right claim means the police treat white people more harshly than people of colour, when every report and every stat independently produced says the opposite, people seem generally unsure. It's really very mixed. More people do think the police treat those from ethnic minorities more harshly than white people than the other way around. But then it would be vaguely mad to think otherwise, because if ever you see anything in the news, it doesn't take long for a case of institutional racism to pop up into the news. I mean, just before the riots, what did we have? We had a police officer in Manchester kicking a restrained man of colour in the head. He was restrained. He was on the floor, face down. I mean, you know, look at the sheer number of arrests that have taken place in connection with these riots. Hundreds of them. Not a single case of a restrained suspect having a police officer walk past them and kick them in the head on the way past, or pummeled in any way. Yet it's still only a minority who think the police are biased one way or the other in general, but only voters of the Green Party Reform UK, where there is a majority view that the police are biased one way or the other. In terms of the characterisation of the terror attacks and riots being far right, the majority, who probably, you know, if you ask them, don't necessarily know the definition anyway, but they do think of them as far right. A majority think it's far right to perform a Nazi salute as part of a protest, to attack mosques, to intimidate asylum seekers, to carry out acts of violence as a protest against immigration policies, or to attack police as part of a protest against immigration. Only a minority thought various other acts, including Voting Reform UK, classed as far right, which is correct. Again, the public are, on balance, right about this. Voting for Reform UK, supporting the Rwanda plan, advocating lower levels of immigration, voting for Brexit and so on, they all appeal to the far right, but they're not far right actions in themselves. In terms of how the public perceive those who took part in the riots, the vast majority think it is fair to characterise them as thugs, criminals, far right and racist, but not patriots. They should have put terrorist in there. That would have been interesting. And it's quite clear that people think that the attacks have highlighted the danger faced by Muslim people, because even as recently as May of this year, so the only thing that's really happened since is a general election campaign and then these riots. As recently as May this year, 25% of the public felt that Britain's not safe for Muslims. So there was already a significant proportion of the public who thought, yeah, there's a lot of attacks on Muslim populations, right? But that's jumped to 53% now. This has woken a lot of people up. There's also been a spike in the respondents themselves saying they feel less safe personally. But as that's not broken down by ethnicity, we don't know if that's driven largely by other minority groups now who feel less safe, because these people weren't just attacking Muslims. In terms of how the public think various players have performed, they've generally been unimpressed with everyone except the police, for which there is net approval. But I think you are likely to get a lot of public sympathy if you are the one in the front line having bricks chucked at you. But the major blame is reserved for social media companies, far outstripping the second source of disapproval, which is Nigel Farage. So there will be public support for action against social media companies if the government thinks it can do anything to make them clean up their act. I still maintain Twitter will be a problem because it's owned by a lunatic. And I think an international response is required there. But taken together, and with some other results that I haven't specifically mentioned, so it's fair to say the vast majority of the public do not take kindly to violent attacks on communities, even where they might agree with the stated grievance. So any notion that violence like this can be part of a strategy, a political strategy, is a dead duck. This may be why Nigel Farage had to U-turn, and why, as a result of taking a hit in approval ratings during this period. A lot of people are saying he's basically blown it with this response. I would say wait a bit. Polls ebb and flow. He may well regain support in another year. But as of now, he's lost support amongst like all groups that you split voters into, including Leave voters. But I would say it shows that although he may be more politically astute than some of the other influential monkeys we've had involved in politics over the past decade, he does get things badly wrong as well. Like, he messed up over Ukraine during the election, as well as on the issue of racism in his party. He's now messed up by not instantly condemning the violence. He was forced to do it in the end, so he had to U-turn, but he lost the opportunity to seize the momentum. He could have actually made gains out of this if he was a bit more canny. He could have positioned himself as the peaceful political outlet for anti-immigration sentiment, Because at this point, he could have been making the point, the peaceful means were growing a movement which now has parliamentary representation, whereas following the path of violence was only putting people in prison. And he could have used that to actually grow support. But instead, there is now a good chance he's put people off permanently who may have voted for him in the future. But again, like I say, you don't just take one snapshot on a poll. We'll have to see how it's viewed in a year or two when the dust settles. But as the violence has certainly not impressed the public, can only be supposed that those who drive or attempt to drive similar acts of violence in the future clearly don't care about political power in this country because it's not a route to it. It's provably not a route to it. Nigel Farage apparently doesn't like these attacks being called the Farage Riots, even though he is arguably the single most influential person who provided the conditions for them over many years. I don't think he had any direct role in them, but in terms of providing the rhetoric, getting the rhetoric mainstream that allowed others to inflame enough people to get out there. But whether he is chiefly responsible or not, directly or indirectly, I do think he probably regrets that they happen now, given that it has done his own reputation a bit of harm. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.